Right. Thank you all for joining us. We looks like we have a fairly full room, which is great. I'm Anne Gray. I didn't put it on my thing, but I will be the moderator for this conversation. I hope you're in the right place. This is realistic mistakes in military SF. So our description that might have brought you here says, protagonist characters and institutions in military SF can't be perfect and infallible, but there are also some actions they should be culturally conditioned to avoid. What errors and pitfalls are reasonable and realistic within a military SF setting? Are there any mistakes that military SF characters are especially likely to make? What changes if it's non-Western or non-modern military tradition or whatever is assumed? So we'll see where this conversation takes us. I was actually kind of reminded of being ready for this panel this morning as I took the fastest shower that I possibly could, and it reminded me of all my father's stories of boot camp for the Air Force and taking a 5-minute shower, including shaving in cold water. Most of my understanding of military tactics comes from being a human factors engineer for military subcontractors in AI and robotics and submarine stuff and command and control of dismounted infantry using high-tech DARPA technology. Marking a virtual landscape with heads-up displays and lasers and gestural command and control. Anyway, I will be enjoying where we go. If anybody has any particular mistakes that they want to highlight that happened in some sort of military SF that you saw or read, please feel free to throw it in the chat. If you do have a question for someone in particular or something you really want to make sure we catch as a question, put it in the Q&A. And I'll try to bring it up when appropriate. Right now, I'd like to invite our panel to introduce themselves. And if you want to say a little bit about your interest in this topic, that would be great too. Tom, why don't you start us off?
I'm Tom Doyle. I'm the author of the American Craftsman series from Tor Books, which is magician soldiers and psychic spies. And among the many things I immersed myself in writing those books was a lot of military history, and I've been a fan of reading that in the past. And within the books, people do make mistakes, and some of them are, you know, as said in The Princess Bride, the classic blunders. And so that's an interest of mine as well. I'm also more recently the author of Border Crosser, a psychological space opera of revenge and seizing control of one's own mind. And I'm currently working on a series of adventures set in the 6th century BCE, which involves military aspects. It's about a secret agent for the Judean court in exile who's sent on secret missions by Cyrus the Great. And so looking forward to talking about blunders.
Great. Jim?
My name is Jim Beall. I'm a nuclear engineer. I've been that for about 50 years. So I deal a lot with the technology of energy and how you use energy. And a lot of that technological stuff works into military science fiction. I've also been a war gamer longer than I've been a nuclear engineer, and I've been a science fiction reader even longer than that. So I have an interest, and this overlaps a lot of them, particularly how technology can, should, and what surprises they may present.
Great. Okay, Danielle, please introduce yourself.
I'm Danielle Ackley-McPhail. I am an author, editor, and publisher. I am one of the contributors to the Defending the Future military science fiction series. I am a Navy brat, and a lot of my experience with the military is collateral by being surrounded by a lot of people with military experience, military war games and such, and research. I have just finished my military science fiction novel, Dare's Devils, which is set to release later this year through eSpec Books. And that's why I'm on the panel today.
So does anybody make a classic blunder in Dare's Devils?
I think the biggest classic blunder that you find in all military science fiction is at some point they have to disregard the chain of command. You really can't propel these types of action stories without the characters taking initiative, and that isn't always something that fits within the military structure. Doesn't survive when you're out in the field. So you see a lot more individuality rather than team. That aspect's there too, but I should say in character-driven military science fiction, the characters are more to the forefront rather than the team being the entity.
That's interesting in that if I could contrast two different breaks of chain of command in science fiction, where in the Star Trek series, where in the old days, you know, Kirk was very far away, orders were delayed, so, you know, he would have to take initiative and maybe get the, you know, approval after the fact, the old philosophy of it's better to, you know, apologize afterwards than
Beg for
ask
forgiveness and ask
permission.
for permission.
Yeah. So, and those were fun, but in the movie franchise, the sort of breaks in the chain, you know, and military discipline and such that you see there seem really that Kirk is kind of just picked out of obscurity to, you know, head the ship at various points and does all sorts of discipline breaks. That did not seem functional. That did not seem, people might enjoy that sort of wish fulfillment, but in terms of military structure, it didn't seem realistic. It seemed like it would cause all kinds of trouble. And it's not a guy you would want in Starfleet, no matter what the results of any particular incident.
Even if you're diverging from the process and the training, you still have that training that still shows in your thought processes and the decisions that you make.
Yeah, and he just seemed to be, you know, operating as an individual in a way that would be over the long haul counterproductive in that sort of setup. So I don't think he ends up being the youngest captain in a Starfleet that's well run.
That way. I actually was just mentioning before this panel that I just finished reading the second book in Niven and Purnell's duology, Mountain Guide's Eye and The Gripping Hand, which is an alien contact situation where actually, I mean, the space forces are naval and very similar in many ways to our Navy in terms of chains of command and following them and having secret orders that are only broken open at if certain circumstances avail themselves. And you do have the occasional person who's not in the chain of command that that does interesting things and then finds themselves serving the military in the second book. But one of the interesting things is that they have an alien species there that does have an entire cast of warriors who never ever fail to follow directions. And so in the second book, they actually, that's one of their main strategies, the humans, is they're actually counting on a set of warriors, a fleet of ships led by warriors, not to change what they're doing, no matter what the humans do, because they get them out of contact, out of communication with their masters. So there can be no change of direction. So it can be used interestingly, I think.
In the mid 1970s, when I was serving on board the USS Long Beach, they showed a movie in the wardroom. It was the movie Patton. I'd already seen the movie Patton in the theaters. And to my surprise, the US Navy had snipped a couple pieces out of the movie. And the piece one of the pieces that bears on what we're talking about here, they snipped out is Patton's army is one of the armies that has invaded Sicily. and he's being ordered not to take Palermo. And he's on the outskirts of Palermo, ready to take it. And he says to his subordinate, "I think that was garbled. Go get confirmation of that and take your time." That was snipped out of the movie. So they did not want the people in the United States Navy wardrooms and ships getting the message that you're supposed to pretend like you didn't get an order.
Bad example. Yeah. Interesting. Did we lose you, Danielle?
No, I had to get up, so I didn't want to disrupt anything.
Oh, okay. So breaking the chain of command is an interesting point. And there was of course, sort of not a question, more of a comment in the Q&A that what makes for good drama is when something goes wrong. And so, of course, sometimes that does result in people being lost and communication being lost, or in, field promotions, which do, of course, happen in the military.
I think
I was going to ask Jim something when he mentioned about technology, and this is something that comes up in the Jack Campbell. Well, no, not John Henry brings this up personally. It doesn't actually come up in his series very often. He's a big kind of, when he talks in person and in social media, the chasing of certain big shiny technologies by militaries that consume all sorts of resources to get and don't actually serve the purpose of winning the war. And there have been science fiction stories that use this sort of blunder. And the instance that comes to my mind is when the Germans pursue the V2 program as a big shiny that wastes a lot of resources.
Correct. Flying bomb program, V1 and V2 for that matter.
Yeah, well, but I mean, you're someone who knows a lot about the technologies that we pursue, that others pursue. Is this a common thing where they go off and pursue the big shiny at the?
It is. And in fact, if we would have lost World War II, it is possible the Manhattan Project might have been considered one of those. That is, we threw an enormous amount of resources at a bomb, a technology that ended up, we didn't need it in the war, we would have won it anyway. Where if we lost it in 1944, people would say the Manhattan Project might have been the cause of it. But you have to, I think that Hitler gets a bad rap here in many ways. If you say that Germany optimizes this for its production of its existing hardware and minor improvements in their hardware, they might have the hardware, but they won't have any people left to operate it. So he was really looking for a home run. I consider it more to be the equivalent of a person who's suffering from what would be considered to be terminal cancer. He's offered a chance at a miracle drug that probably won't work, but it might work. And the existing ways to cure it will not work. What do? Do you extend life knowing that you might have hit a home run or you might not? Or do you take the miracle drug and it either kills you quick or you're cured? Which one do you do? I put most of those programs more in that category than I would in the other.
I think we can look at that from another angle as well. A lot of times these technologies are hyped up by those that actually have them or are developing them as a distraction to the other side, to redirect them towards that, to get an advantage from their distraction.
Yeah, one of the interesting things I would say about the Manhattan Project in particular, like a lot of people were working on the problem of how to get energy out of nuclear reactions, but one of the most secret things that we did, as that a lot of Americans still don't even really know about, was create an entire uranium refinement city in was it Tennessee or something? It was Oak Ridge, and there's a book about it called the Girls of Atomic City by Denise Kiernan. untold story of the women who helped win World War II. Like if we had not come up with enough enriched uranium for the bomb, the scientific developments of the Manhattan Project would have been kind of for naught. So it was, that was a case where we were actually doing something very secretive. And I don't know if we had a distraction tactic or not, but yeah. These days, everyone knows you need enough uranium. So internationally, we're all watching who has it and who doesn't.
To go back to something that Anne said earlier, you were commenting on the military and encountering those from other cultures. And that's something that really can play strongly in military science fiction, because not only do you have the different cultures with different mindsets that don't necessarily fit the military mindset that we're trained, but you have people and species from other planets that are totally alien to anything we recognize, let alone just culturally different. That can also lead to the famous military mistakes that lead to the wars.
And also there's, with that sort of conflict of culture, a lot of really big blunders happened because one culture did not respect the military prowess of the other. And you have that, you know, some of the big colonial era defeats happen because they do things that they would never do against an enemy that they thought was on par with them. But, and, you know, divide their troops in the face of the enemy, you know, get baited into, you know, attacking a well-defended position. And these things happen, you know, several times over, and sometimes, as in Ethiopia with the Italians, to actual lasting effect as far as the geopolitics. Sometimes it's just a speed bump in the road for the colonial power. Other times it, you know, it really changed history afterwards. But, and you could see that would, depending on the level of difference in technologies as we encounter other species, you'd see where that sort of disrespect of the other party would potentially lead to errors of that sort.
History and science fiction both contain a lot of examples of that. We were mentioning before the panel began the Zulu War, and the British did have superior technology. They knew they did. They knew they could fight a disproportionately larger force. What they didn't understand was that the Zulus were very adept at operational actions and were very adaptable. When they began to see how cannon worked from a distance, they began to lay down flat as soon as the gunner put his flaming wand to the touch hole. So cannons ended up losing a lot of effect. A lot of times commanders don't understand how adaptable their prey is, their foe is. And a lot of it goes back to intel. A lot of people assume that you have a certain level of intelligence against who you're fighting. Mistakes in intelligence, whether they are tricking you, whether they're more adaptable than you are, or many not knowing where all the forces are, you get surprised by another force that's been hidden from you. A lot of times, a lot of mistakes are done to inadequate intelligence.
Or an unwillingness to believe the intelligence somebody mentioned earlier in the chat.
I agree with that also.
Yeah, I worked for a little while for a company that was researching decision-making, and especially expert decision-making processes. And one of the differences that you would note between an expert strategist and an up-and-coming young officer in war games was that the expert strategist would see cues in the landscape that would lead them to seek out additional information. Like, oh, well, I see, you know, signs of a unit over here. I see signs of a unit over here. But what I really want to know is, where is the command outpost? So I'm going to look for it. And the way I see the troops, you know, dispersed, I'm going to predict that the command outpost is over there. And then, of course, once they bring instruments to bear, they are able to confirm that. And, you know, the younger officer next to him had no clue that that was something that they should look for. And we often find that in expert decision making, they have, it looks like they just perceive everything at once in a very complex situation, but actually part of it is that they're seeking out more information to prove or disprove a certain idea about the battle scene.
And the number of times that experts disregard the terrain in that sort of way, supposed experts, is shocking. In the Zulu battle, the Zulus were able to use the terrain to stay out of, you know, direct, out of view of the British until very late in the game, where they, you know, could see maybe part of the Zulu force, but not all of it. And, you know, they had advanced into this position where the terrain could be used that way against them.
Well, that was classic in the American Revolution as well, right? We'd learned more guerrilla tactics from the Native Americans as we fought them, and then we turned around and used those against the British.
Right. And but it even, you know, goes back to, there's medieval battles where the French knights wouldn't be aware that they were charging into marshy ground, you know, wet ground, and go in and have their horses break their legs, and, you know, the knights would fail against the local unmounted.
Yeah, I was recently reading 1493, which talks a lot about the conquistadors going into South America and how their rope-based weapons were actually very effective against horses, because they'd throw things that would bind the horse's legs and they would fall.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
In the mountains, that's a big problem. Your horse falls and it keeps falling.
Long ways down.
I had mentioned in our pre-discussion where a science fiction show, Tribes of Europa, really annoyed me in that sort of thing with regard to the terrain. You had a tribe that was supposedly built around hiding in the woods, and their sort of village is in kind of a ravine, and they know that there's a group of warriors coming to attack them, and yet they don't hide in the woods. Like, I was the whole episode, I was waiting for them to hide in the woods, like they always said they would, you know, trust the woods to hide them. And they never did that. Instead, they just sort of stood in a group in the middle. And when the crows showed up at the top of the ravine, you know, anyone with any military tactics is like, oh no, they have the high ground, scatter, run, hide. And instead they just all stand there and get shot.
Not good.
Not good. Does anybody have any other examples of those moments where you were reading or watching something and you were thrown way out of it because you were just like, no, that
makes no sense.
That makes no sense.
I'll give you one. And when I read it, I was about to say, no, this can't be right. And then I realized that exact same thing had actually happened historically. The person was actually retelling an actual historical event. It was we mentioned Pornell earlier, in one of his Janissary's books, Clan and Crown, I believe it is. At the beginning of the battle, the forces are staring at each other, and some knight in the great armor and a big long lance and all that fancy stuff comes out and challenges the good guys, shall we say. And the young king goes out on a horse without any armor, nothing but a hand axe. And they charge him, as you could expect he does. And the guy on the palfrey just dodges him, and with a backhand of his axe takes his head off. And that so demoralizes the other side that they're already half lost everything already. So I would say you could underestimate the effects of a charismatic person doing some deed in front of all your people and changing morale. Turns out Roger the Bruce did exactly that at the beginning of the Battle of Bannockburn between the Scots and against the invading English. They were invading, and they came up and challenged, and King Robert the Bruce was up there, and the knight comes forward. The knight is a known historical person. He's well recorded who he is. And Robert the Bruce just goes at him with a palfrey and does exactly what Pornell has the character do. So you'd say, no, that can't happen. It's wrong. But then it really did happen. So truth is stranger, that can be stranger than fiction. Fiction is real. There are many events that you don't understand, and you say can't happen, but they really did. So I would say that action by a charismatic individual is something that a Western person might not really understand the importance of. It
And
might
it's
change
certainly
it
an
up.
example of his opposition underestimating him, right?
Well, it's not so much they underestimated Robert the Bruce. What they underestimated was the morale impact on their troops of seeing this humiliation occurring. In fact, didn't Game of Thrones do something just like that? Where they had, in one of the episodes, the Dragon Queen is in front of a walled city, and a person comes out, a knight in armor, the city champion, and challenges to a fight, and one of her people comes forward with nothing but a dagger and a sort of a sword, and walks forward, and the guy charges him on horse, and he throws the dagger and kills the horse, and the guy falls off the horse. Before he can get up, still stunned, the guy takes his head off. And it so demoralizes the town that they're pretty much easy meat after that. The effect of a charismatic action is something that a Western person would not be expecting.
But there have been instances where that sort of individual combat goes the other way with a clever enemy, where there's a story, I think in Herodotus, where one of, Polus is having this sort of fight with another, and they've, selected a small group to have this fight against each other. And the one city is losing these, kind of smaller things to avoid the war, but they have supposedly an oracle that at a certain moment when they hear this cry, that's when they'll win. And there's something that happens that they go, that's the cry, we're all going into war now. They just say, forget about this, we're losing this individual stuff. We're just going to, now surprise them and break whatever arrangement we have, and they end up winning because they're just so appallingly shocking in their disregard of the protocol. So yeah, it was a bad morale situation, but the one side saw that they were getting beaten on the sort of field of morale, and they were going to lose. If the individual stuff decided the fight, they were going to lose what the war. And so they say, just, well, we're not going to do that. We've decided.
Well, David and Goliath is another example too of the same thing. David and Goliath is another example.
Yeah, the unexpected hero. You see that in a number of cases where you see there's an army set up for a great battle, and then they're like, well, maybe just our champions could fight each other in a single duel. And then if it's an unexpected winner, I think I was just recently watching some of the early Stargate, and there's a situation in there where it's partly because it's culturally, a shift. He has a female warrior with him, and they're dealing with a culture that's extremely patriarchal, but there are some people who want it to be not so much. And so he, he's like, well, if your champion wants to fight me, but it has to be, somebody who's a leader of men or whatever, and they're like, that's her, and he's like, what? And of course she wins the duel. What you were saying, Jim, also reminded me of that moment in The Fifth Element, where Bruce Willis's character is like, oh, I know these aliens, this particular group of bandits, if you take out their leader, they'll just give up,
And that great line, does anyone else want to negotiate?
Yeah, exactly.
Where'd he learn to negotiate?
So are there any other heroes like that you're fond of in SF, military SF?
Well, the actions by individuals is really the story of so many science fiction stories of this type. Everything from Conan the Barbarian to almost anything. How about King Arthur, Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court? How about that one?
Sort of a time travel book, isn't it?
Yeah. Samuel Clemens, of all people.
Mark
Writing
Twain.
time travel.
Sometimes you have, the story of again going back to the Jack Campbell material, where you have a charismatic figure, but he is constrained, he is definitely, and he's in command, but he is also very constrained by sort of realistic problems of, politics in the fleet and a very desperate situation. And seeing an individual have to also, how that individual interacts with the group and the broader stuff. It's not just them out there in a duel or them, being one flash of brilliance or whatever, but a kind of long slog of how do I as an individual get these people to come together, and how do we get the job done? And that's interesting too. That's, and perhaps more, in line with realistically, or more common at least, of how does an
Yeah,
individual commander make a difference in a group action?
the team is interesting. I think that's one reason why certain ensemble things come across really strongly. Danielle, I think you were saying we don't always see the team, but in situations where we do, it can be really powerful. I think that's part of why Firefly was so popular. You have the charismatic commander, but the flawed commander, right? Like, he's still bitter about the Browncoats losing, and he still gets himself into bar brawls about it and stuff. And so then you see his team having his back and, saving him, or in those situations where he gets in trouble and then their ship comes up above the cliff, and suddenly the other guys are like, oh wait, maybe we're outgunned in this situation. He's just like, ha, but if his team hadn't been there, he would have been screwed.
The team of misfits where everyone has their own strength, and as a whole they function together.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I just saw that. I was rereading Robert Asprin's Hit or Myth, and in one of those, to take a very different sort of military situation, the young protagonist gets hired as a court magician and gets sent to fight a vast army, and he's like, I can't possibly do this with my magic. So his demon mentor is like, well, it's not going to be just us. We're going to go recruit some forces, and they totally fail at recruiting like their own army, but instead they bring a band of misfits who each have their own strength. And in that case, you see, again, the army facing them makes a whole bunch of mistakes because they have no idea what they're capable of. Tom?
Oh, I was just thinking, I'm sorry, I just had my hand up because it was like, but no, I had a thought that I think one reason we like the team story is a lot of the classic blunders are in fact a surprising level of internecine hostility between officers who should be working together. People who are willing to sacrifice the interests of their country and large numbers of their own soldiers, just so long as the other guy fails. And this happens repeatedly. It happened at Tannenberg. In World War I, the Russians had this officers at the head of the two different army columns were hostile to each other and not talking to each other and not willing to both ask and give help during that operation, besides the communications difficulties they had. At the one of the things that goes wrong at the charge of the Light Brigade is some of the people in that chain of miscommunications are hostile to each other. There's a weird British naval battle at Cartagena, where the naval element and the marine elements, the commanders are hostile to each other and willing to let failure happen. Maybe not as bad as it does happen, but they're undercutting each other, and that just stuns me.
And do they do it all the way through? Because I can think of a lot of situations like in the Dragon Riders of Pern and stuff, where you have people who are hostile factions, but then some, Orweening need arises and they unite and don't fail. But you're talking about
they end up failing because of this and making a bigger disaster perhaps than they really actually wanted. And so that, I think, is, that's why, in science fiction fantasy, we like to see the opposite, maybe, because so often in the real world, they don't come together. I love it when a plan comes together. Well, sometimes these people.
Well, fiction is held to a higher realistic standard. It has to make sense to the reader, even if it's not what would really happen in history, because if the story doesn't make sense, then you frustrated them.
Well, and sometimes I think we hold to that too much. There's that magical group that's going to survive through the whole thing, and or like, and people get so fond of characters. I mean, that did happen in Firefly when they released Serenity. A whole bunch of people were like, "Oh no, you can't do that." But it is, of course, realistic for any group to lose people, even just due to a bad accident or something. I always loved, I think it's David Gerald, his writing in fantasy, that he had what seemed to me a realistic death rate of characters that you actually cared about. There wasn't this sense of, oh, this is the special ensemble that will magically not be struck.
If you're invested in the character, they're fair game. Because otherwise the death has no meaning.
Right. Yeah.
Among the other mistakes that Western leaders might make, or advanced technology people might make, is, we said intel earlier, but logistics is something that is can change at a moment's notice. The volume of tonnage for food, supply, water, remunition, medicines, evacuating wounded, all those things are things that a Western decision maker thinks that he or she has compensated for, but often has not. For example, if you're fighting an environment you're not used to, you may underestimate how much water your people drink if it's hotter. You may underestimate that you need certain kind of mosquito repellent. You may not understand some element of the terrain. There's a weird battle fought in Africa during World War I between the British forces and the German forces, in which artillery was used. And what they didn't realize, the commanders didn't realize, was that particular town was famous for something locally. And all of a sudden, all they saw were all their people running in random directions, towards the enemy, away from the enemy, everyone, both sides. Turns out that the town was famous for its honey production. There were like 1,000 beehives there, and they had just fired a bunch of cannonballs into the beehive area. And there were millions of very unhappy bees.
Oh no.
And both forces just basically became disorganized and random in directions. They were more concerned about getting stung by 100 bees than they were being shot by 1 or 2 rifle shots. In fact, in a war game, that's how I learned about this. There is a role that if you enter this hex and any gunfire occurs, your forces will run in random directions. And I had to go look that up.
I think these days we expect so low losses in our own combat, partly because we have such high tech that can advance in front of our personnel. When we read about things, I mentioned 1493 before. There were a number of expeditions into South America trying to reach, trying to extract rubber from the rainforest and things like that, where it was really the insects and disease that won the day. It wasn't any people fighting. It was the fact that the Europeans couldn't stand up to the malaria and whatnot.
Another one about logistics is ammunition supply. I mentioned. If you look at war games, if you accurately model what units are like, units, the longer they're in contact with the enemy, become progressively of lower combat effectiveness. They have less combat power. They're losing people. But American forces in World War II didn't behave like that. It turned out that American forces, the longer they were in contact with the enemy, actually had greater firepower. And it turned out the reason why was Germans, because they were manpower efficient, would withdraw units from combat and reinforce them, retrain them, reissue, and send them back out to the front. Whereas the Americans tried to resupply in place. What that meant was, over time, casualties who had BARs, Browning automatic rifles, and Thompson submachine guns, they would die and they'd be replaced by another guy with a new Thompson submachine gun. Well, the Thompson submachine gun was still there. It was just being used by somebody else. And Americans were notorious for keeping and hoarding combat resources. One company actually retained a platoon of Shermans that got lost in the logistic trade. And they spent a lot of time getting gasoline and ammo for its guns for their infantry unit. How would you model that? How would you figure out the logistics challenges of that? By the way, that might have helped inspire Kelly's Heroes, by the way.
I was just thinking that. Donald Sutherland. Oddball.
So it comes from the truth. So you underestimate the logistic demands of supplying your forces. That's a mistake a Western decision maker could easily make.
You see that in the Marvel universe too, quite a bit of people picking up the enemy's weapons and ammunition. I think some of us learned some of what the Americans learned about that. We learned through the Revolutionary and Civil Wars. You know, Alexander Hamilton first made his name stealing cannon from the other side, and I was just down at Harper's Ferry, where one of the worst losses that the Union Army took had to do significantly with losing control of an armory and quite a lot of guns, because we didn't have enough men to defend them, basically. Somebody asked in the Q&A specifically with regard to the Civil War, are there examples in fiction of someone like General George McClellan? Let's just switch to answered, and I was reading it. Who gave up opportunities for victory because he was so excessively
Cautious.
Cautious. Like he didn't do a good job of following up on his victories and running down and claiming the territory that he just could have secured.
I think you see it more, that situation more often from the side that's causing the other side to be cautious, because you know, it's kind of frustrating if you're in the POV of the side with a McClellan on it. You see it with basically bluffs, people who are using tactics that seem to indicate that they are larger in number with more resources and that having that effect, causing the other side to hesitate, or as, you know, Kirk would say, not chess Spock, but poker, you know, just bluffing the aliens. And, you know, in history, in the Civil War, you saw lots of examples of that. The old, you know, parading a continuous line of troops in the sight of the enemy. That's, you know, the line of troops and cannon or whatever are just doing a circle, but, you know, the enemy is sitting there counting each pass as a, you know,
As a new line.
A new bunch of troops.
Danielle, did you have any examples?
I don't, but I wanted to speak to your comment about the hoarding of the weapons. They're all gamers.
Oh, we came into this dungeon. What's here? What can we take? We just won a battle. What new arms do we get? That's a good point. I have to say, I was always disappointed that Jedi weren't more assertive in their battles. Not always, but sometimes, you know.
You see that with the good side of, sometimes there's a divide within it between people who want to follow a cautious approach that will end up losing, and they kind of know it will end up losing even, you know, but they go, no, we have to do it this way. That was in the Jack Campbell books at the beginning. There were folks who were ready, you know, to surrender because, as far as they could see in the terms of the battles that they had been fighting way too long, they'd settled into a pattern. Well, if the battle reaches this point, you surrender. You don't keep going and, you know, try to think of something new.
Another form of blunder Taras mentions in the Q&A, sometimes a hero goes inadvisedly into combat because they feel they need to contradict questions about their personal courage. So you don't surrender because you're trying to prove something. Taras mentioned in the Janissary series, there's an example of that where someone gets away with it, but it seems like maybe in real life that doesn't usually end well, or?
Well, and there's the beginning of the show Rome had a good example of what people thought about folks who broke the line to go out and do something, you know, personally courageous, which is, yeah, that was fun for you, and now we're going to execute you at dawn because we can't have that sort breaking the line. You're breaking your protection of your fellow soldiers, you know, to do something. Yeah, you had a good time, but you risked your fellows, you know, and
But Wonder Woman gets away with it, right? I mean, you can't stop Wonder Woman from.
Well, the character that the original questioner was talking about, that was Galloway, I believe. And in that very same internal discussion that character has, he remembers a point in history where it went bad. He said that the person who led his people into battle one time, he said, I just got to do it once so they'll believe me from now on. And he said he died in that battle. And that person who died was the only person after Robert the Bruce who had the chance to reunite Scotland. There's another example from history, and that is Adolphus Gustavus, or maybe it's the other way around, Gustavus Adolphus, the Swedish ruler, who was a king also of battle. He was a magician on the battlefield. And he was attacked one time, his unit was, and he led the counterattack. And it was gunfire. And so the counterattack won. It crushed the enemy, won the battle, maybe even won the war, but he died. And they didn't realize he was dead until after the battle was over. And Sweden never recovered from that.
Yeah. And that's a big plot point in the 1632 books, where they, you know, do a lot to go, no, you aren't going to die this time. You know, that's a big thing. They know, you know, where and when he's going to get into trouble. And it's like, yeah, we can't let that happen again. You're going to stop.
Hiding your commander is something that, you know, some science fiction does well, right? Like Padme and as Queen Amidala did that pretty cleverly, but in a lot of instances, you don't, like especially in space battles, like you can pretty much always tell where the command deck is on the ship, and they just, you know, fly into that, and you're good. You know, you just got rid of a whole bunch of generals. So we're at 2 minutes. Is there anything anybody else wants to add about the topic, or if you want to take a minute to just tell people where to find you and your stuff out on the internet and in the world?
I am dropping a promo code in the chat.
Awesome.
All my books are available everywhere, but also on the eSpec Books Square site, where you can get a 20% discount on all orders over $20 for this weekend.
Yay. Are you out on social media and you have your own website too, right?
I'm everywhere. Just type in Danielle Ackley-McPhail. You'll find me somewhere.
Okay.
There's only one of me.
Jim, any final thoughts? Or
I would say that the most likely mistake that's believable if you're trying to write these kinds of things are ones where the commander has adequate basis for the decision that's being made, but there's that the enemy, his opponent, has found a way to hide something from that person. And it's whether they've figured out a compensatory measure, whether they figured out something else. There's some surprise. So you don't really have as good an intelligence level as you believe you do. Maybe you don't realize the environment's bad. Maybe you don't know there are beehives there. Whatever it is, there's something there that you can figure out that compensates for the whatever advantages he believes he has.
Yeah, that's another good Firefly moment when the agent thinks that he's nerve blocked Mal, and it turns out that Mal has an old injury that makes that have no effect on him whatsoever.
So yeah, fog of war stuff. That's, you know, a lot can happen under that. I'm again Tom Doyle. I've put my website tomdoyleauthor.com in there. If you're particularly interested in the military stuff, that would be my American Craftsman books. Otherwise, Border Crossers out, and look forward to letting you all know about Graphic Audio's production of my 6th century BCE series and it's been a great panel. You guys are great.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining us in the panel, and thanks to all of our attendees for sticking it out. And we'll see you the rest of the day here in Balticon. And a couple of us are going to go over to the Discord. We're in Mount Washington.
And I have to man my table at the eSpec Books in Discord and GatherTown.
So you can find Danielle there, and we'll see you around. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. That was great.